Accession number 6380, rule number 1.
Sir John Colville, rule 1. Could I start off by asking you, Sir John, the circumstances in which you first became an assistant private secretary?
I was in the Foreign Office when the war started, having been there 2 years, and I wanted to go and join my brother's regiment in the army. And Sir Alexander Cadogan, who was the head of the Foreign Office, tried to dissuade me. I had every right to go because I was just under 25, and 25 was the reserved age. However, they bribed me not to by making me junior private secretary to Mr. Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister, at 10 Downing Street, and that was such an exciting possibility to be right at the centre of the war that I felt I couldn't refuse it. So I went to 10 Downing Street in end of September or early October 1939, and then when the government changed in May 1940, I was more or less taken over with the furniture. I was the junior private secretary, and I was the one who had not been connected in any way with Munich or appeasement or anything like that, although in fact I was a strong, and still am, a strong believer that Munich was absolutely right. And a point I used to argue with Winston Churchill in subsequent years.
What was the comparison between Mr. Chamberlain and Mr. Churchill? Did you enjoy working with Mr. Chamberlain?
I admired Chamberlain because he was a man of tremendous integrity and determination, but I must confess he lacked charm and he lacked warmth. It wasn't really until right towards the end of his life, when he was a dying man, that I suddenly began to see a glimmer of what I'm sure was there, which was a really rather wonderful character and personality. But as his private secretary, and indeed all his private secretaries, we really shared in no way in his family or private life. I mean, we none of us ever went down to Chequers, and the relationship was very formal. He was a very good boss, and perhaps I can tell you one story which shows that. I became his junior private secretary at almost exactly the same time as Burke Trend, subsequently Secretary of the Cabinet, became junior private secretary to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Sir John Simon. After 2 or 3 weeks working at number 10, the principal private secretary there, a man called Arthur Rooker, who was a delightful personality, gave me a job to do which would be shown to the Prime Minister. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was really, I think, making a précis of a very complicated and difficult paper which the Prime Minister wouldn't have time to read in full. At almost the identical moment, the John Henry Woods, Principal Private Secretary of the Treasury, did precisely the same with relation to Burke Trend. But the difference in the reply was so interesting. My paper, which I wrote with fear and trembling, went up to the Prime Minister and came back the next morning with a comment written on it in ink saying, I think this is a very well done paper. I congratulate Mr. Colville, NC. Now, I don't think it probably was a very well-done paper, but it was Neville Chamberlain trying to show confidence and give encouragement to his junior private secretary. Burke Trend's paper came back in the morning, torn into 4 pieces without any comment. And that is the difference between Neville Chamberlain and John Simon. Now, Winston Churchill liked young people of both sexes. He liked young men, he liked girls, and he always took a great deal of trouble with young people. To give you an example, it's quite a different thing from myself, but at various periods in the war I was impressed by this. I remember once going on, I think it was the King George V, on a battleship, and Churchill, although he was very much burdened by events at that time, spent a whole hour going down to the gunroom to talk to the midshipmen, all of whom clustered round him and asked him all sorts of questions, and he treated them exactly as if they were his equals. In fact, they forgot he was the Prime Minister and Minister of Defence. And he did the same when his annual visit to Harrow, his old school. He used to go, after the concert, he would collect round him all the senior boys and talk to them for half an hour, three-quarters of an hour, an absolutely charming way, so that they all were deeply impressed. Now, Neville Chamberlain could never have done that. And equally, his relationship with the younger members of his staff, and perhaps for some reason rather particularly myself, I'm not ever quite sure why, except that I think he was fascinated that somebody should want to leave him and go away and join the RAF. He became, I think I can say, rather fond of me, and for that reason. But when I was alone with him, driving down in the car somewhere, or perhaps occasionally lunching alone with him at Chequers, because we all of us went to Chequers all the time, with one private secretary each weekend, one would have arguments with him. I particularly remember one argument about the merits of Munich, and one really forgot one was talking A to one's boss and B to the Prime Minister, and let fly and gave all one's arguments. And he never minded a bit. He would talk to one absolutely as man to man, as if you were a contemporary. And that was a remarkable attribute of Churchill, which I think is very rare amongst great men.
When you first heard that the Prime Minister was going to be Churchill, what was the reaction in the private secretary's office? Was it one of a certain amount of trepidation, given his reputation?
Total horror. There was a theory, which was quite untrue, that Churchill had been scheming and planning and plotting against Chamberlain. Now, whatever Churchill's faults, and like any other human being he had some, he certainly was never an intriguer. It wouldn't have occurred to him to plot against his boss. I think that, who was the Prime Minister, I think that possibly some of his more enthusiastic supporters may have tried to encourage the Daily Mirror, for instance, to run articles against the Prime Minister, but never Churchill himself, and never, I'm sure, with his approval. However, there had grown up at number 10 a feeling that he was irresponsible. We all knew about Gallipoli, about the support for the White Russians, Archangel and all that, about the return to the gold standard, which in those days was thought to have been a disaster, though nowadays a lot of people think it was really rather a wise move, and all that kind of thing. And there was a general feeling that he was a man who was irresponsible and who would go in for wild and undigested schemes. This wasn't just number 10. It was very much the feeling in the cabinet offices, people like Sir Edward Bridges and General Ismay. And one must remember that he was held responsible in Whitehall circles for the failure of the Norwegian expedition. He had indeed been very enthusiastic about it. It was not, I think, a very well planned or coordinated operation, and its total failure was held to be the fault of the First Lord of the Admiralty, Churchill. So he arrived at number 10 with a wall of suspicion. Now, the two senior, or one of the senior private secretary, departed and went off with Chamberlain, and he brought with him two of his secretaries in the Admiralty. The remarkable thing is that we all got on extraordinarily well together. There was never any friction. New people joined us in due course, John Martin and Leslie Rowan. I was, of course, the only one who'd been there, apart from Anthony Beaver, who was responsible for the patronage questions. As a matter of fact, I was responsible for patronage questions up till the autumn of 1940. But the principal private secretary, a man called Eric Seal, came to see me one day and said that he thought it was no reflection on the proposals I'd made about appointing bishops, but that he did think my hair was not quite grey enough to do that. I was, after all, only 24, and that Anthony Beaver had better do it. But then he added rather nicely, but I think in a way you are more likely to be successful in dealing with the Prime Minister than Anthony Beaver. And that indeed was true, because I did get on with him very well, and I think Anthony Beaver was rather alarmed by him anyhow to begin with, though he became very fond of him. So there we were with a gathering of 4 men. Finally, it used to be 3, became 4, and 1 woman, Miss Watson, who'd been there since the time of Bonner Law and Lloyd George, and we were the private office, plus a man called Commander Thompson, who was a sort of flag lieutenant that Churchill brought from the Admiralty, and whose only job was to arrange journeys abroad, who took no part in either political or administrative affairs. And his 1 or 2 outside advisors and friends, such as Lord Cherwell, Brendan Bracken, and Desmond Morton. We all got on extraordinarily well. There was no friction at all in the private office that I remember the whole time, well, the whole war, or the only periods I was there. It was a very, very happy ship indeed. The Prime Minister was incredibly inconsiderate as regards hours, and he was, I think, without being a selfish man, because he was very generous, he was enormously egocentric. And it never occurred to him that what suited him or what he wanted might be extremely inconvenient for other people, whether they were his colleagues in the cabinet or his staff. But despite all that, and despite some silly things that have been said by certain biographers since, he was deeply loved by everybody at Number 10, from the junior typist right up to the principal private secretary. He was held in the greatest affection. I'll give an example of that. Sir Horace Wilson, whom Churchill didn't approve of, although he kept him on as Secretary of the Treasury, but he ceased to have a room at 10 Downing Street, as he had in Chamberlain's time. His secretary, Miss Davis, was a very outspoken and marvellously honest and straightforward, but sometimes rather ill-tempered Welsh lady, devoted to Horace Wilson and violently anti-Churchill. She became, in due course, one of Churchill's greatest admirers. But this was interesting because she started with a really very, very strong antipathy. And to get over that and to become, as she did in the course of 2 or 3 years, a really devoted admirer, was, I think, a tribute to Churchill's personality and the way he could win people over who had started by being hostile.
How much actual say does the Prime Minister have in the appointment of his private secretaries? Is it totally up to him? Because you stayed on, I'd see, but others left. Well,
private secretaries, and that included Miss Davies, I was just talking about, are civil servants, and they do what they go where they're posted, and as far as that is concerned. The Prime Minister, of course, must select his own staff. At the beginning of hostilities on May the 10th, 1940, he had really other things to think about rather than look at me. He had his 2 people from the Admiralty whom he knew, Eric Seal and John Peck. Beaver was rather banished into a back room, and he didn't really have time to look at me. But as the years went by, I think he did take considerable interest in, well, because obviously the personalities of his private office were important to him, because people he was going to see every day and at weekends. He became very choosy in his second administration, between 51 and 55, when I was his principal private secretary, and had 1 or 2 minor personnel problems there, because although he never said he disliked anybody, it was quite clear sometimes he didn't think one particular man was appealed to him.
Yes, I've always heard this stories about Churchill as being very attached to people that he knew, and that certain men were often advised that, if possible, they should do their job without coming into contact with the PM, because he preferred the faces that he knew.
Yeah, he did. Of course, that was one of his weaknesses in some ways. I think in a book I read something, I said that the call of old Lang Syne was very strong with Churchill, and he did make several appalling appointments, such as Sir Roger Keyes, who was a disaster as Director of Combined Operations, merely because he named them in the First World War. And he was inclined to say, oh yes, I knew so-and-so, and try and appoint them to some job. He did it again in his second administration when he brought back Woolton and Leathers as overlords, and they were both admirable men in that time, but they had really had no job to do. And as far as his private secretaries went, that is absolutely true. Once he got used to a face, it became part of the scheme of things, as he would call it. And I know when I went away and joined the RAF in the late autumn of 1941, and a very nice fellow called Francis Brown was seconded from the Foreign Office to take my place. It took Churchill quite a long time to get used to him. When he did get used to him, he became very fond of him, and he became fonder of him still when Francis Brown insisted on going off to join the Coldstream Guards at the time that I came back from the RAF. And anybody who went and did anything military was sure to be enormously liked and admired by Churchill. But then there came the awful moment in another time I went away. I was always going in and out of number 10, and a very nice fellow was produced to take my place temporarily, but shown to the Prime Minister, who looked at him, didn't say very much, and I won't give his name, but because he had a very distinguished career afterwards. But Churchill rang the bell for John Martin afterwards and said, take him away, I don't want to see him again. Well, that was very embarrassing for all concerned. And then, when I went off for 3 months fighting Lee in the summer of 1944, Operation Overlord, again they brought in a young man from the Admiralty to take my place temporarily. And Churchill was, in fact, quite nice to him, but he really couldn't ever get quite accustomed to him. He liked people he knew, and when I came back, no merit of mine, but merely old Lang Syne, I mean, I was welcomed with open arms and taken straight off to the Quebec conference and so on, because it was a familiar face. And it went literally a familiar face. On one occasion I got, in the RAF, I got all disgusting diseases, impetigo, and from sleeping in infected blankets. And that led to, because they're allied in some strange medical way, to chicken pox. And I was away for 3 or 4 weeks recovering from these 2 horrible diseases. And as I couldn't shave, I grew a beard, and then a moustache. Well, before I went back to number 10, I was well enough to shave off the beard, but I left the moustache, which I rather fancied. And Churchill, I went in to greet him. He greeted me very warmly, but he looked at me oddly. And then he rang the bell, and he said to one of my colleagues, what has happened to Jock Colville? He looks odd. I hardly recognize him. To which they said, well, you may have noticed, Prime Minister, he's grown a moustache. Have it shaved off at once, he said. So I did. But I mean, as I say, a familiar face had to be the same face he'd seen before.
I wonder if we could turn now to the routine of number 10, beginning with your own personal routine as Assistant Private Secretary.
Well,
this particularly in the period 1940-41 at the time of the Blitz.
And well, it was the same really then and later in the war. We all had our own particular jobs, in a sense. Mine was, of course, I was the only Foreign Office representative in the staff, so all Foreign Office papers and Foreign Office telegrams came to me. I also dealt quite often with some of the defence telegrams and so on, but there was no use or no point in being just a one-man job, except for the patronage side, because we'd had to take it in turns to be on duty for 24 hours at a time. This is largely because of the Prime Minister's habit of working till 3 or 4 in the morning, and we couldn't all be about, so one private secretary would be on late duty at number 10, and in order to try to get that absolutely worked out properly, And Maximilian, you would then be on duty at 8 o'clock the following morning as well. So, and then, of course, there were the weekends at Chequers. And therefore, you had to know about all the papers in the Prime Minister's box on whatever subject they were. And, of course, his box, which he worked from, had a lot of folders in it. Some were marked for defence, some Foreign Office telegrams, minutes from General Ismay, replies from General Ismay, and then every kind of subject was in the different folders. And therefore, as a private secretary, you had to know about the whole lot. You couldn't suddenly find yourself at Chequers on a Friday evening, going to be there till Monday, being ignorant of the various papers in the box. So you had to have, apart from your own private employment, and as I say in my case, largely Foreign Office matters, you had to have a general knowledge of everything that was coming to the Prime Minister, even if you didn't understand it, with the one exception of Boniface. Now, Boniface was what was the decrypts, or whatever the proper word is, of the German Air Force and subsequently naval and military ciphers was called. For some reason, the man who wrote a book about it called it Ultra. Ultra was its name in the Admiralty. But elsewhere in Whitehall, it was always called Boniface. But it's now become known as the Ultra Secret. And that was... I mean, I never heard the word ultra until that book was published, although I obviously knew all about it. We weren't supposed to know all about it, because those came to the Prime Minister, those signals, in yellow boxes, with VRI on them, because they were very old boxes, used for the purpose, and they were brought by, personally, by Minges, who was the head of the Secret Service, Brigadier Minges, and he came in and changed them round. Quite often the Prime Minister didn't look at his yellow boxes. He was too busy with something else, and Minges would come in, open them, the special key, take away the ones that were out of date or of no value, and would sometimes say, I think there's this box has got something which the Prime Minister should see urgently. And that would be done. Well, he read his yellow boxes, but the great thing about those decrypts, I think after he got used to them, they were very detailed. They were about the enemy order of battle and that sort of thing, which was of great interest and importance to the Joint Planning Staff, to the JIC, and to the Chiefs of Staff, but not really of immediate importance when it came to the general policy of the war. So that they were less important to the Prime Minister, or indeed to members of Cabinet, I think, than is very often made out. Of course there were exceptions. There was a famous Moonlight Sonata, the Coventry raid. Now that's a curious one. The Prime Minister didn't know anything about it. I think they may have been mentioned by the Chiefs of Staff that there was this big thing brewing 2 or 3 days before. But it wasn't until he opened his yellow box on the way down to Ditchley, somewhere in the middle of Hyde Park, and the car was going down, and read about the Moonlight Sonata thing, that he became aware that there was going to be this big raid, which he assumed would be on London. And he then turned the car around. He had John Martin with him, who was several times testified to this. And I can testify to it because I happened to be on duty at number 10 that weekend. The Prime Minister, to my horror, because I've been looking forward to a quiet weekend, suddenly reappeared that November day and sent me off to what he called the Borough, which was the deep shelter in Down Street, and said, you know, you're too young to die. London is obviously going to be flattened. And then I don't think it was until quite an hour or two after that it became apparent that the raid was going to be on somewhere like Coventry or the Midlands. He didn't know that when he turned the car round. I'm not even sure that he ever knew until it was or happened, because he certainly went. I remember John Martin telling me, well, I was safe in the Borough with John Peck, my colleague. He and John Martin and the Prime Minister climbed onto the Air Ministry roof, which he used to do regularly during the air raids. He liked to watch the fireworks, so to speak. And he climbed up there to watch it, and nothing happened. This vast bomber force went, I suppose, north of London, straight to Coventry.
I wonder if I could now ask you, Sir John, what was the relationship between the Number 10 staff and the offices of the War Cabinet?
The private office, as Churchill called it at Number 10, and I should perhaps point out that until Churchill became Prime Minister, the word private office was one exclusively used by the service departments, and particularly by the Admiralty. Before the war, and indeed in Chamberlain's time, the private secretaries at Number 10 were never known as the private office. It was a naval term and came in with Churchill. Their relationship with the cabinet officers was very close indeed, because the two main props of Churchill's way of carrying out the war, conducting the war, were Sir Edward Bridges, Secretary of the Cabinet, and General Ismay. Both of them were secretaries of the Cabinet, one the civil, the other the military. And when Churchill wanted something examined, he would send a minute, usually marked action this day, either to Bridges or to Ismay. And so they were constantly at Number 10. And then, of course, in the CWR, during the Blitz, which was the only time we used the CWR, we didn't use it in non-air raid times, they were there the whole time because their offices were there. And so in the evenings when we dined in the mess in the CWR, that was until Number 10 had its own mess, which it did after a bit, thanks to Brendan Bracken. But for quite a long time, I mean, down there, and one would go and have a drink there in the evening, one always found all the members, senior members of Sir Edward Bridges' staff and of General Ismay's staff. And we got to know them all very well. And particularly General Ismay's, because on Churchill's foreign tours, which he always took one or sometimes two private secretaries, there would always be not only General Ismay, but either General Hollis or General Jacob. And so we got to know them all extremely well, and as a lot of our work tied in closely with theirs, they were invariably having to deal with sharp questions coming from the Prime Minister or from the Minister of Defence, whichever role he was assuming.
Accession number 6380, roll number 2.
Sir John Colville, reel 2. You mentioned, just before we paused, Sir John, about the CWR, and I wonder if I can ask you now about the Prime Minister's use of the Cabinet War Rooms.
Yes. The Cabinet War Room was built, I think, just before the war, the map room and everything, and we used to get reports from the map room CWR, and even in Neville Chamberlain's time. But it didn't come into full use as far as the Prime Minister was concerned until the Blitz began at the beginning of September 1940. A bedroom was prepared for the Prime Minister in the, as it were, the first floor of the CWR, while there were a lot of bedrooms below that, which were prepared for him as well, which was thought to be safer. And he did take a great deal of trouble about the security, because he had a passion for building, and I remember 2 or 3 times having to go with him in the evenings with torches down to where they were putting up traverses and other brickwork in the basement in order to make the building stronger. And he used to go along and comment on them, and there was one great occasion when he climbed up onto one of the traverses that was being built and jumped down the other side. Although he was in his late 60s, he was still pretty active, and landed in a pool of liquid cement, which I thought rather funny. And I looked over the wall at him and said, I think, sir, you've met your Waterloo. Whereupon he looked around and he said, my Blenheim, please. Anyhow, he did take great interest in it, but he didn't really like living there. He slept in his downstairs bedroom a number of times in September and early October 1940, but he really didn't start using the CWR very much, except for meetings of the Cabinet and the Defence Committee, until the Annex, as it was called, the Annex to 10 Downing Street, was built on the floor above, which was just above pavement level, in the what was then the Ministry of Works, or the Office of Works, is now I think the Ministry of Defence. And when that was converted into a really rather beautiful flat by Lady Churchill, who had the most marvellous tastes, and even in wartime could make a bleak-looking flat perfectly charming. When that had been done, he used to sleep there. He had a bedroom there, and he had a small office there, and Lady Churchill had her bedroom there, and they had a drawing room and a sitting room, and there were the private secretaries' offices and so on. But as far as possible, he liked working at number 10, and it made life very difficult for the private office, because we never knew where we were going to be next, whether we were at number 10 or at the Annex. And one was always running between the two, through the Foreign Office courtyard, up King Charles Street, through the courtyard, into Downing Street. So he liked being at number 10, which he liked the atmosphere there very much. And so we never quite knew where we were, but it wasn't until the Annex was ready, which was towards the end of October 1940, that the Churchill Churchill family's domestic home became the Annex to 10 Downing Street. And that was not the CWR, it was the floor above the CWR. So he would go down, I think if I remember right there was a lift, into the CWR in the evenings or during blitzes for meetings of the Cabinet, which very often happened at night, or the Defence Committee, which always happened at night. But in the daytime, except when there were very heavy raids going on, he would move over to 10 Downing Street, which is where the Cabinet would meet. The CWR was therefore in great use in September and most of October 1940. Whether it was much used during the Doodlebug period, I don't know, because I was away in the Royal Air Force myself in 1944. But as soon as the bombing stopped in May 1941, then life started again at number 10. Although, because Lady Churchill said she really couldn't keep both number 10 and the CWR, or rather the Annex, going, they continued to live at the Annex, and did so right up till the end of the war. In fact, it was in the map room at the Annex, which wasn't the one in the CWR. Churchill had his own map room made on the same level as the Annex itself, that's to say, a level above the CWR. It is in that he watched the election results in July 1945. So he went on using it right up until the end of the war and beyond. Indeed, during the 45 election campaign, his headquarters were still at the Annex to number 10 Downing Street, although in the daytime they might be at number 10. He had the downstairs rooms, the typists' rooms at number 10, shored up with huge sort of wooden supports in them, and they were converted into a very pleasant dining room and drawing room and a bedroom for the Prime Minister, right on the sort of, on the garden level at number 10, below the level of Downing Street itself.
When the Prime Minister was using either the CWR or the Annex, where did you and the private secretaries work?
We had two lots of rooms. We had rooms in the Annex, beyond the Prime Minister's rooms, because it was a long sort of flat. It went right round the corner and adjoined the Cabinet offices. We had rooms there, one in which the two senior private secretaries worked, and another in which I and another private secretary and one of the clerks. We had three very able clerks, headed by a splendid man called Barker. And we worked there, and there were other rooms for typists along the passage, and the secretaries. And on the other hand, we also had still had our offices in number 10, which of course were used when the cabinet was meeting there, and so on.
Now, I think you mentioned in your diary, Sir John, that Mr. Churchill actually had his meals at the CWR. On October the 17th, the entry states, dined at CWR.
No, that was not him. I dined at the CWR. That was me, not the Prime Minister. I don't think he ever had a meal downstairs in the, what we call the mess at the CWR. I'm trying to think where he did dine during the Blitz. I think he went, yes, I'm sure he was stayed at number 10 for his meals, because there was the awful occasion when a bomb blew in the kitchen, and he was very worried and ran downstairs to see if the cook was all right. That was certainly in October 40. I think he had most of his meals at number 10, bombs or no bombs, and went over to CWR in the evening. But I don't remember I'm sure he never dined or lunched at the CWR mess, or indeed at the annex until it was ready at the end of October. He used sometimes to go to the Down Street tube shelter, which had been prepared by the Underground Railway executive, and had most comfortable accommodation and splendid rooms. He did go there, I should think 7 or 8 times, and spend the night there, when the things were very noisy, because he didn't really like his bedroom in the CWR, although he certainly did use it on a number of occasions. And I very well remember that he used it very often to rest. He'd had his afternoon rest. And I remember vividly going into his bedroom there one evening, and he is just when Neville Chamberlain died. And he was dictating to Mrs. Hill, one of his personal secretaries. He tended to use his personal secretaries for dictating, and not the staff, not the typists at number 10. And he was dictating to her a very moving speech, which he made next day in the House of Commons about Neville Chamberlain. And that certainly was lying flat on his bed, looking, I think, not totally proper, because he did rather forget who was in the room sometimes, lying on his bed there and dictating this beautiful piece of prose, which was a marvellous, really memorial speech to Neville Chamberlain. And that he certainly did in his bedroom in the CWR. He also, I think he dictated quite a lot from that room, quite a lot of his speeches, because he liked to lie in bed and dictate. Although I don't think, but I may be wrong, I don't think he broadcast from the CWR. He may have done so on one occasion, but normally he broadcast from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street, where the BBC would bring their apparatus.
Right. You actually left the number 10 in autumn of 1941 to join the RAF. I wonder if you can tell me what prompted you to make that decision.
Well, just that I didn't like to be left out of the fighting. I thought, you see, one lived a very spoilt life at number 10. One had all these weekends at Chequers where there were diplomatic rations, which I had to be because the Prime Minister was always entertaining people. The Prime Minister himself couldn't do without his bottle of champagne for lunch and for dinner, or his 12 or 15 cigars a day. And as he was very generous-minded, he always gave them to his private secretaries too. So that I found I was living in the flesh pots, whereas all my friends and contemporaries were fighting. And I just didn't feel I could go on doing that. But of course, by that time, I was beyond the 25-year-old reserve. I was reserved. And I had great difficulty in getting out. But finally, with the help of Lady Churchill, Mrs. Churchill, she was then, and Brendan Bracken, and one or two others, he was persuaded to let me go. And he did say to me at the time, well, I wouldn't let you go if you weren't joining the RAF, because the RAF is the cavalry of modern war. And so he let me go, and I really felt I simply couldn't bear to miss taking some part in action. So I became a pilot in the RAF, and then after 2 years, or a little bit more, but yeah, it must have been 2 years, about the autumn of 43, when I'd done my training in South Africa and come back, and just, it was a very slow process in those days, just got into an operational squadron flying Mustangs. I was sent for number 10, and Winston said it was time I came back. So I pointed out I'd only done 1 operational flight. Oh, he said, well, you can do 6, and then you must come back. So I did 5 more operational flights, rather saying to myself, well, if I get killed on one of these 5, it'll be a bit unlucky. And I came back number 10, just in time to find that the Prime Minister was thought to be dying. He was terribly ill, pneumonia, in North Africa. And I was still in uniform, sent to fly out with his wife to join him out there. Well, of course, immediately I was out there, we went on from Tunis to Marrakesh, I discovered about Operation Overlord. So I went back to my boss and said I couldn't miss I was now a trained pilot, and I couldn't miss the most exciting and largest warlike operation in all history as a trained pilot. And after he said to me, you seem to think this war is being fought almost exclusively for your own amusement. However, having got that one off his chest, he then said I could have what he called 3 months fighting leave, but no more holidays this year. So I was allowed to rejoin my squadron about 10 days before D-Day, for June, July, August 1944. And then I came back to number 10, my 3 months fighting leave being up, went off to Quebec conference with Churchill and remained with him until the end of the war.
When you returned, did you find there was a great alteration obviously in his health?
No. Lord Moran made an awful lot of nonsense about that. You see, I think Lord Moran had to find an excuse for writing an inexcusable book. He told me that I had discovered he'd written it, and I asked him about it, and he said, well, I have to make, when I die, my wife will have no money, I must provide for her. And I put in a book, which then I was made to take out on the grounds that it was libelous. This was the most honourable reason for doing a dishonourable thing, because it was dishonourable for a doctor to write about his patient's health, particularly as he only saw him when he was ill. And the man, it wasn't Churchill was tired, and who wasn't at the end of the war, but he wasn't really ill. The man who was ill, and did make a lot of difference to what happened after the war, was President Roosevelt. And now, if Lord Moran or his American equivalent had written a thing about Roosevelt's health, that would have had some point. But Churchill really wasn't ill until in 48 he had a small stroke, and another in 53. But he survived them remarkably well. And after all, he had a stroke in June 53 and went on as Prime Minister till April 51. And there was no more peaceful or happy or successful administration after the war than that between 1951 and 1955. So I think Lord Moran talked a lot of rubbish. And I think he did it because he wanted to write the book. He writes very well. There are a lot, as I pointed out when I reviewed it, there are a lot of minor errors in it. I mean, he can't really have written it in his diary every day, because when we were going off over on the Queen Mary, he called it the Queen Elizabeth. Well, if you were on board, you wouldn't do that. So he must have embellished it a lot afterwards. And, of course, he was never present when important discussions took place, except at meals. And quite often Churchill went, and in fact he always did go on talking at lunch and dinner on business matters. So he picked up a certain amount there. But again, in reviewing the book, I said, which I think is true, Lord Moran was never present when history was made, though he was quite often asked to luncheon afterwards. What he did do was to go and ask people like Lord Allenbrook and others what was happening and what happened, and then make notes of what they said in reply. But he really, I don't think his book is a thing that should be taken too seriously by historians, because it's not a truthful account of Churchill's state of health at that time. And this is a point which was made very strongly by Lady Churchill and by all the people who knew him well, General Ismay, Edward Bridges, all of us. And that's why, at Lady Churchill's request, I organised the writing of a book called Action This Day, Working with Churchill, which was a reply to Lord Moran by 6 people, all of whom knew Churchill really rather better than Lord Moran, and certainly saw him much more of him.
Now, after he had lost the 1945 election, you actually remained on as a private secretary for a while.
I remained on with Atlee for only about 3 or 4 months. Because as a civil servant, one stayed on. Anyhow, Churchill and Atlee, Churchill I once asked Churchill, some years after that, which of his Labour colleagues he liked and admired the most in the war. I expected him to say Bevan, because I knew he was very fond of Bevan and thought very well of Bevan, but rather by surprise he said, oh, Atlee. I don't think they were attuned, really, to each other. They hadn't got the same sense of humour, all the same, but they both respected and admired each other. And they each had a sense of humour to this extent, that when, after the 45 election, the Tories went to town about a letter that Professor Lasky had written, and Churchill wrote to Atlee about it. I'd been lent to Churchill for a week to help clear up, and I drafted, he asked me to draft a reply to the letter that Atlee, whose private secretary I was, had written to him, which I did. And I took it back and handed it to Atlee, who looked at it and said, I bet you wrote this so you can help me draft the reply to Churchill. So I did help draft 2 of the letters. In fact, I drafted one of them completely, the one from Atlee back to Churchill. But all that was looked upon as a jolly political knockabout. I mean, there was no ill will. Churchill told everybody that the people had decided and that it was the duty of the opposition to oppose, but they must be constructive. And Atlee lent Churchill his own Prime Minister's aeroplane, which they had in those days, to go away on a holiday. So, I mean, there was very good will between them.
So, Sir John Colville, thank you very much indeed.